My name is Aspen, and if you've eaten a Crater Crisp in the last decade, you know my work. You just don't know my name. For 15 years, I was the quiet engine in the research and development heart of Omnisnacks, the lead food scientist who turned a mediocre corn chip into a global phenomenon. I wasn't just an employee. I was the architect of their flagship brand, the keeper of the secrets that made their product line worth billions. They called me the office mom, a name I once wore with a sort of weary pride. It meant I was the one who remembered birthdays, the one who fixed the unfixable problems, the one who cleaned up everyone else's messes with a calm smile and a perfectly calibrated formula. But in the world of corporate predators, being the mom just means you're the first one they sacrifice when the family gets a new, colder father. My new father was a man named Griffin. He walked into the CEO's office with a silver-tongued charm and a vocabulary composed entirely of buzzwords. He loved talking about disruptive innovation and lean integration, but he couldn't tell the difference between malic acid and citric acid. He praised my 15 years of loyalty in a company-wide town hall, holding me up as an example of Omnisnacks' family values. 2 weeks later, he sidelined me, burying me under a mountain of paperwork while 3 new 20-something hires, all with flashy marketing degrees and zero lab experience, were given the exciting new projects, the projects I had proposed. The final blow came on a Tuesday. It wasn't a meeting. It wasn't a conversation. It was a calendar invite from Human Resources titled Synergy Realignment Discussion. That was it. In a sterile, windowless room that smelled of industrial carpet cleaner, a woman I'd never seen before read from a script. My position was being eliminated. My loyalty was thanked. My severance was a joke, a calculated pittance that was more insulting than getting nothing at all. As I sat there, a quiet heat flushed up my neck, but my face remained a perfect, placid mask. Griffin didn't even have the courage to be there himself. He just sent his proxy to execute the woman who had built his kingdom. But here's the thing about being the quiet, overlooked mom in the corner. You see things, you hear things, and you prepare. What Griffin, in his infinite disruptive wisdom, didn't know was that the single most important piece of intellectual property in his entire company wasn't his. The final critical patent for the flavor binding agent, the very molecule that made Crater Crisps revolutionary, the secret sauce I invented in a fever dream of late-night chemistry, was filed under a little-known entity called Keystone Innovations, LLC, a side business I'd started years ago for tax purposes, a dusty legal shield I never thought I'd need. Now Omnisnacks' entire 10-year product expansion plan, the very future Griffin had staked his reputation on, was entirely dependent on a licensing agreement, an agreement with the office mom they had just unceremoniously kicked to the curb. My name is Aspen, and this is the story of how I taught a corporate titan that the person who builds the house is the only one who knows exactly where all the load-bearing walls are. It helps to know I'm not just screaming into the void. So if you've ever felt undervalued or overlooked, let me know in the comments. Your story matters, and hearing them helps me remember why I fought back. The drive home from the Omnisnacks campus was a blur. I remember the sickly sweet smell of the vanilla air freshener hanging from my rearview mirror, a cheap gift from a secret Santa exchange years ago. It felt like it was choking me. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white mountains on a pale landscape. I parked in my designated spot in the concrete garage beneath my condo building, the same spot I'd pulled into for 12 years. I turned off the engine, and then I just sat there, in the sudden, profound silence. The breakdown didn't come as a storm. There was no screaming, no violent sobbing. It was a slow, quiet leak. A single tear tracked a path through the light dusting of foundation on my cheek, and then another. It was a grief for a life I hadn't even realized was gone until it was taken. 15 years. I had given them my 20s, my 30s, and the dawn of my 40s. I had missed weddings, postponed vacations, and eaten more sad desk lunches than any human should. All for them, for the product, for the team, for the memory of a place that no longer existed. My mind, a place usually filled with chemical equations and flavor profiles, was a static-filled void. Then, slowly, the ghosts began to arrive. The first was Mr. Abernathy, the original founder and CEO. He was a kind, rumpled man with flour always dusting the cuffs of his suit jackets. He'd hired me right out of my master's program. I was young, ambitious, and utterly terrified. He'd seen something in me, a spark of obsessive creativity that other, more corporate interviewers had found unsettling. I remembered my first major project. The company had a chip, a basic, forgettable corn triangle called the Corn Cruncher. It was bland, it broke easily, and its seasoning fell off if you looked at it too hard. Sales were abysmal. Mr. Abernathy called me into his office, which was less of an office and more of a chaotic laboratory filled with books and strange culinary gadgets. He didn't give me a corporate brief. He pushed a bowl of the chips across his desk and said, "Tell me a story with this, Aspen. Make it a story people want to hear again and again." For 6 months, that was my entire world. I lived in the lab. My life was a cycle of gas chromatographs, mass spectrometers, and endless frustrating taste tests. The problem was fundamental. Flavor, at a molecular level, is a fleeting thing. It needs something to hold on to. The surface of a corn chip is a chaotic, uneven landscape. Conventional oils could carry flavor, but they turned the chip greasy and muted the corn's natural sweetness. I needed a bridge, something that could bind the flavor to the chip at a microscopic level without altering the texture. I needed to cheat culinary gravity. The memory of the breakthrough is still as vivid as the day it happened. It was 3 in the morning. The lab was silent except for the hum of the ventilation system. I was exhausted, running on stale coffee and pure stubbornness. I was thinking about my father. He was a polymer chemist, a man who spent his life creating long-chain molecules for industrial applications. He used to explain his work to me in metaphors I could understand. He'd say, "Think of it like tiny little hands, Aspen. Billions of tiny hands that can be designed to grab onto one thing and one thing only." I was staring at a diagram of a starch molecule when it hit me. What if I could create a food-grade polymer, an edible, flavorless chain of molecules with a hydrophilic end and a lipophilic end? One end would grab the water-based molecules of the chip's structure, and the other end would grab the oil-based molecules of the seasoning. It wouldn't just coat the chip, it would become part of it. A molecular scaffold for flavor. I called it a flavor-binding agent. Mr. Abernathy called it magic. We rebranded the Corn Cruncher as the Crater Crisp, named for the deep, texture-rich pockets on its surface that were perfect for holding the new, powerfully bonded seasoning. It launched a year later. Within 2 years it was the best-selling snack product in North America. My name was on the Internal Development Award, a cheap plaque that I kept on my desk. Mr. Abernathy gave me a significant bonus, and more importantly, his trust. He made me his go-to problem solver. He used to say, "If it's impossible, give it to Aspen." That was the world I had loved. That was the company I had given my loyalty to. Then Mr. Abernathy retired. His health was failing, and he sold the company to a private equity firm. The transition was brutal. The firm saw a balance sheet, not a family. They saw assets, not people. They installed a series of CEOs, each one more obsessed with cost-cutting and synergy than the last. The culture of innovation was slowly replaced by a culture of fear. The lab, once a playground of discovery, became a place of budgets and quarterly reports. I stayed. It's a question I've asked myself 1,000 times. Why did I stay? I think in my heart, I was trying to protect Mr. Abernathy's legacy. I was the keeper of the flame. I was the only one left who remembered the why behind the what. I became the office mom because I was the only one left who treated the product with the reverence it deserved. I mentored the junior scientists, shielded them from the worst of the corporate politics, and made sure the quality of Crater Crisps never wavered, even as they slashed our budget to the bone. And I was loyal. That was the word Griffin used. Loyalty. He said it like it was a quaint, charming character flaw. In his world, loyalty was just a lever for exploitation. I remember the day he arrived. He held a town hall in the main cafeteria. He was all teeth and tailored suit, a picture of modern corporate leadership. He talked about unleashing shareholder value and optimizing our human capital. He didn't talk about flavor or quality or the story Mr. Abernathy wanted us to tell. He talked about Crater Crisps as a legacy cash cow platform that would fuel our expansion into adjacent verticals. It was like listening to a robot translate a business textbook. He met with me once, in my lab. He walked through, his expensive leather shoes clicking on the linoleum floor. He didn't look at the equipment, he looked at the head count. He saw my little plaque and picked it up. Aspen Reed, he read aloud. Lead food scientist. Abernathy Award for Innovation. He smiled that empty, polished smile. Mr. Abernathy was a legend, he said. It's so important to honor our history. He put the plaque down and then gestured to the lab. So this is where the magic happens, huh? I tried to explain the nuance of the flavor binding process, the constant calibration required to account for variations in corn harvests, the new dill pickle flavor I was developing. He wasn't listening. His eyes were scanning, calculating. I can still hear his parting words. It's great to have someone like you, Aspen. Someone with so much institutional memory. It's a real anchor for the team. An anchor. That's what I was to him. Something heavy, old, and holding his shiny new ship back. The sidelining started a month later. A young, ambitious marketing graduate named Kyle was put in charge of new flavor initiatives. He came to my lab with a PowerPoint presentation full of focus group data and demographic charts. He wanted to launch a line of dessert-flavored Crater Crisps, tiramisu, creme brulee. I explained patiently that the flavor-binding agent was specifically designed for savory, lipid-soluble flavor compounds. Its molecular structure wasn't compatible with the esters and aldehydes that create sweet profiles. It would be an unstable, muddy-tasting mess. He looked at me with a blank, uncomprehending stare. The focus groups love the concept, he said. We just need you to make it work. It was an order, not a collaboration. I was no longer the architect, I was a technician. A pair of hands to execute the bad ideas of people who didn't understand the fundamentals of my own invention. I was being erased, pixel by pixel, from my own picture. That night, sitting in the dark, silent tomb of my car, the full weight of that erasure crushed me. It wasn't just a job, it was my identity. Aspen, the creator of the Crater Crisp. Aspen, the woman who could solve the impossible. Who was I without that? Just Aspen, a 42-year-old single woman with a condo and a paltry severance check. The anger began to burn through the grief. It was a cold, quiet fury, an anchor. He had called me an anchor, and he had cut the rope, thinking he would sail away faster, not realizing I was the one holding him to the seafloor, to the very foundation of his business. And he finally got out of the car and went up to my condo. The air inside was stale. I walked through the familiar space, my hand trailing along the back of the sofa, the edge of the dining table. It all felt like a stranger's home. In my home office, a small room crammed with textbooks and old notebooks, I pulled a dusty box from the top of the closet. The label, written in faded marker, said LLC Docs. Inside was a thin binder. I opened it. The first page was a certificate of formation from the state of Delaware, dated 10 years ago. Keystone Innovations, LLC. I had almost forgotten the name. I'd started it on the advice of my accountant, after receiving that first big bonus from Mr. Abernathy. He'd said it was a good way to manage freelance consulting work, if I ever chose to do any, and to create a liability shield, a tax strategy, a piece of boring financial paperwork. I'd named it Keystone after my father's old chemical company in Pennsylvania, Keystone Polymers. And Innovations was a nod to Mr. Abernathy. It was a private little tribute to the two men who had shaped my career. I flipped through the pages, operating agreement, tax ID assignment, and then I saw it, tucked into a sleeve in the back of the binder, a thick, stapled document from the United States Patent and Trademark Office, patent number US 11, 304,508B2, a method for covalent flavor bonding to a starch-based substrate. Inventor, Aspen Reed. Assignee, Keystone Innovations, LLC. My heart, which had been a leaden weight in my chest, gave a single, powerful thud. I remembered it now. The company's lawyers, back in Mr. Abernathy's day, were swamped. He had told me the company would cover the legal fees, but that I should use an outside firm to expedite the filing to beat a competitor to the punch. He said, "You're the inventor, Aspen. You get it filed. We'll handle the assignment paperwork later. We just need it protected." We did get it filed, and then Mr. Abernathy got sick. The acquisition happened. The assignment paperwork, the legal document that would have transferred ownership of the patent from my LLC to Omnisnacks, was lost in the chaotic shuffle. No one ever followed up. For 10 years they had built a multi-billion-dollar empire on a technology they didn't own, and they had no idea. They had assumed the paperwork was done. They had assumed the quiet, loyal office mom had signed away her life's work for a salary and a cheap plaque. They had assumed I was an anchor. A cold, clear thought cut through the fog of my anger. It wasn't a thought of revenge. Not yet. It was a thought of structure, of leverage, of a foundation. Griffin thought he was building a skyscraper, but he had just fired the woman who owned the bedrock it was built on. A slow smile spread across my face in the dim light of my office. It felt foreign, like a muscle I hadn't used in years. The tears were gone. The grief was gone. In their place was a clarity so sharp and bright it felt like a physical object. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reminding them of the rules of physics. An anchor doesn't hold a ship back. It holds it in place. And when you cut it loose in a storm, you don't sail faster. You wreck. The first step in any complex chemical synthesis is to gather your reagents. My plan was no different. It wasn't a plan born of rage, but of a sudden, crystalline focus. For years I had operated within a system, playing by rules someone else had written. Now, I was writing my own. It wasn't about burning down the old house. It was about building a new one, on a foundation they had forgotten they'd given me. My first call was not to a lawyer, but to Leo. Leo Martinez was one of the younger hires Griffin had brought in. He was a brilliant chemical engineer, barely 25, with an infectious passion for the science of it all. Griffin saw him as part of the new guard, a replacement for the old furniture like me. But Griffin, in his typical superficial way, had missed the most important detail about Leo. Leo was a scientist first, and a corporate climber second. He had come to my lab a few months prior, looking completely defeated. Kyle, the marketing wunderkind, had demanded he produce a prototype for a spicy margarita, Crater Crisp, within a week. The concept was chemically absurd. The citric acid and the capsaicin were reacting in a way that created a bitter, almost metallic aftertaste. Kyle didn't care. He just wanted a sample for a presentation. I had found Leo staring at a gas chromatography reading, his head in his hands. I didn't say anything, just pulled up a stool next to him. I looked at his notes, at the molecular diagrams he'd scrawled on a whiteboard. I pointed to a specific bond in the capsaicin molecule. "You're trying to brute force it," I said quietly. "You need a buffer. Have you tried isolating the heat compound with a microencapsulation of maltodextrin before introducing it to the binding agent?" His head snapped up. His eyes, which had been dull with frustration, lit up. The encapsulation would create a barrier, preventing the premature reaction with the acid. It would work. It would actually work. He looked at me with a reverence that was almost painful. "How did you see that so fast?" he asked, his voice full of awe. "Because I've made that mistake before," I told him, "about 100 times. I spent 2 hours with him that afternoon, walking him through the delicate art of balancing antagonistic compounds. I didn't just give him the answer. I showed him the path to it. I treated him like a scientist, not a resource." At the end of it, he shook his head. "They call you the office mom," he said. "It's not true. You're a professor, and this place is a university." I think it was that moment, that small act of mentorship, that built the bridge I now needed to cross. I called him on his personal cell. He answered on the second ring. "Aspen, is everything okay?" I heard the rumors. His voice was laced with genuine concern. "I'm fine, Leo. I said, my own voice calm, and even better than fine. I just have a question for you. Hypothetical. What would happen if, say, the formula for the flavor binding agent was suddenly unavailable? There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear him processing the implications, the scientist in him running 1,000 scenarios at once. Unavailable. How, he finally asked. Like, the documentation is gone? No, I said. Let's imagine the intellectual property itself, the patent. What if it wasn't owned by Omnisnacks? He let out a low whistle. That's not a hypothetical, is it? He said. No, Leo, it's not. He didn't ask for details. He didn't question my motives. The scientist in him understood the beautiful, brutal logic of it. He just said, it would be an extinction-level event. We can't manufacture without it. Every single production line for Crater Crisps, from the original to the new flavors, uses that agent. It's in the specs for the machinery. It's in the supply contracts. The entire 10-year expansion plan Griffin keeps waving around. It's a list of new flavor profiles, new flavors that all presuppose the existence of the binding agent. Without it, Crater Crisps are just corn crunchers again. They're nothing. They have nothing. His voice was a mixture of terror and exhilaration. I knew then that I had my first ally, my insider. He didn't want to see Omnisnacks burn. He wanted to see good science respected. I told him I needed him to be my eyes and ears. No risk, no corporate espionage. Just be a scientist, observe, take notes. He agreed without hesitation. My second reagent was legal. I looked up the card I'd been given years ago by my accountant, Clara Vance, Esquire, specialist in intellectual property and corporate formation. Her office was in a sleek, minimalist building downtown that screamed expensive and discreet. Clara was the opposite of her office. She was warm, sharp-witted, with a laugh that could disarm a hostile witness. She wore a bright fuchsia blazer and had a pen and paper notebook, which I immediately trusted more than any tablet. I laid out the situation, the LLC, the patent, the verbal agreement with Mr. Abernathy, the lack of an assignment document, the termination. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and steepled her fingers. She had a single predatory gleam in her eye. Aspen, she said, her voice dropping into a low, conspiratorial tone. This isn't just a case. This is a work of art. She spent the next hour peppering me with questions, her pen flying across the page. When was the LLC formed? Who paid the patent filing fees? Was it a personal check or a company card? I had the records for everything. I had kept meticulous notes, a habit born from a life in the lab. The LLC was formed before the patent was filed. I had paid the initial legal fees to the patent attorneys with a check from my personal account. Omnisnacks had reimbursed me later as a line item on an expense report labeled R&D project expenditures. But the initial transaction was mine. Clara's smile widened. Oh, that's beautiful, she murmured. That is just poetry. They can't even argue it was a work-for-hire situation where they directed and paid for the creation, because you created the legal entity and initiated the patent process independently. Their reimbursement could be argued as a simple project expense, not a purchase of the underlying IP itself. She explained the legal landscape to me. The lack of a signed assignment was the entire game. In the eyes of the law, the owner of a patent is the entity listed on the document with the USPTO, period, until a transfer is legally executed and filed. Keystone Innovations, LLC was the sole and undisputed owner of the secret sauce. Their entire empire, she said, is built on a handshake deal that the other party is no longer alive to confirm, and they were sloppy. Incredibly, arrogantly sloppy. We spent the next 2 hours wargaming. What would they do when they found out? First, she predicted, they would panic. Second, their internal legal team would scramble to find the assignment document that didn't exist. Third, they would try to intimidate. A cease and desist letter filled with baseless threats. Fourth, when that failed, they would try to sue, claiming a breach of fiduciary duty or misappropriation of trade secrets. That's where it gets tricky for them, Clara explained, her eyes dancing with intellectual fervor. They can't sue you for misappropriating a trade secret that you legally own. It's a logical paradox, and to prove you breached your duty, they'd have to argue that your duty included reminding them to do their own legal paperwork correctly. A judge would laugh that out of court. It's a debatable point, of course. A big company, with deep pockets, could drag this out for years. But the beauty of your position, Aspen, is time. They don't have it. Their entire production line will grind to a halt. Their contracts with distributors will be in breach. Their stock price will plummet. They need to license this patent from you yesterday. You don't need to fight them in court. You just need to wait for them to come to you. She leaned forward, her expression turning serious. But you have to be ready. When they come, they will be desperate. You need to know exactly what you want. This isn't just about money. This is about control. What are your terms? I hadn't let myself think that far ahead. The reality of my power was still sinking in. Control. For 15 years I had none. I was a passenger. Now, I was in the driver's seat. I told Clara what I wanted. It wasn't just a licensing fee. It was more than that. It was about respect for the work. I wanted a per-unit royalty, a significant one. I wanted a non-exclusive license, meaning I could, in theory, license the technology to their competitors. I wanted a quality control clause, a clause that stated that any new product developed using the flavor binding agent had to be personally approved by a designated quality consultant, a consultant from Keystone Innovations. And I wanted a key person provision. If Omnisnacks was ever acquired again, the license agreement would not automatically transfer. The new owners would have to renegotiate the terms. With me. Clara scribbled furiously in her notebook. She looked up, a slow, appreciative grin spreading across her face. "You're not the office mom, Aspen," she said. "You're a goddamn queen. You've just built a fortress and given yourself all the keys." My final reagent was the most important, my own resolve. After leaving Clara's office, I didn't go home. I drove to the old industrial park on the edge of town where Keystone Polymers used to be. The building was long gone, replaced by a generic logistics warehouse. But I parked across the street and looked at the spot where my father's lab used to be. He was a brilliant man, a quiet genius who never got the recognition he deserved. He spent his life creating things for other people's benefit, for other companies' profits. He died of a heart attack at his lab bench at 58, overworked and underappreciated. I started Keystone Innovations as a tribute to him, a way to have something that was just mine. I never imagined it would become his posthumous revenge. It wasn't about the money. I kept telling myself that, and I believed it. It was about the principle. The principle that creation has value, that the architect deserves to have her name on the blueprint. Griffin and his ilk, they were just house flippers. They'd bought a beautiful, historic home built by a master craftsman, and they were trying to slap some cheap vinyl siding on it and sell it for a profit, all while kicking the original architect out on the street. They forgot to check the deed. Sitting there in my car, staring at an empty lot full of ghosts, I felt the last vestiges of Aspen Reed, the loyal employee, fade away. She was a good person. She was kind. She was naive. She was gone. In her place was Aspen Reed, founder and CEO of Keystone Innovations, and she was ready to go to work. I drove home and drafted the first document. It wasn't a letter to Omnisnacks. It was a simple one-page press release. Keystone Innovations, LLC, a leader in advanced food science technology, is pleased to announce that it is now open to exploring strategic licensing partnerships for its proprietary flavor binding agent, patent number US 11, 304508B2. I didn't send it. I saved it to my desktop. This was the first domino. I wouldn't push it. I would just wait for them to run into it head first. According to Leo, they were about to. Griffin had just announced Project Velocity, a massively ambitious plan to launch 12 new Crater Crisp flavors in the next 18 months. The first 3 were set to be announced at the annual shareholders meeting in 4 weeks. Tiramisu, creme brulee, and spicy margarita. My quiet, cold fury was now a perfectly stable exothermic reaction. They were about to try and build their future on my flawed, rejected science, and I was about to let them. The silence that followed my termination was, at first, a relief. It was a silence I had craved for years, free from the incessant ping of corporate emails, the manufactured urgency of pointless meetings, and the psychic weight of other people's expectations. For a week I did nothing. I slept in. I read novels. I went for long walks. I let the frantic, over-caffeinated rhythm of my old life drain out of me, leaving behind a calm, quiet stillness. I was decompressing, allowing the pressure that had built up over 15 years to equalize with the world outside. Meanwhile, inside the glass and steel box of Omnisnacks, the pressure was starting to build. Leo was my barometer. He'd send me short, cryptic texts, a simple pressure dropping, or storm clouds on the horizon. He was being careful, and I appreciated it. His observations were clinical, precise. He told me the R&D team had been officially tasked with creating the first 3 Project Velocity flavors. Kyle, the marketing savant, was their new functional head. He had, according to Leo, stood before the team of dedicated scientists and declared, "I don't want to hear about what's impossible. I want to see solutions." The team was in a state of quiet revolt. They were trying to make the dessert flavors work, just as I had, and they were running into the same brick wall of basic chemistry. The texture was wrong, the flavor was muddy, and the stability was non-existent. The prototypes were, in Leo's words, an insult to taste buds everywhere. Griffin, however, was oblivious. He was on a roadshow, promising investors and distributors a revolutionary expansion of their most profitable brand. He was selling a future he hadn't bothered to confirm was possible. The first tremor occurred exactly 2 weeks after my firing. It was a Tuesday. I was in my kitchen, attempting to perfect a lemon meringue pie, a chemical challenge I could actually enjoy, when my phone buzzed with a text from Leo. Seismic event. Magnitude 7. My heart did a little flutter kick. It was starting. A few minutes later, he sent a follow-up. Legal just quarantined the lab. They're pulling all documentation related to the binding agent. I smiled as I folded the meringue. They had finally hit the wall. Kyle, in his infinite wisdom, had likely demanded that the legal team file for new patents on his dessert flavor inventions. To do that, the lawyers would need to reference the original parent patent for the binding agent. They would have gone to their files, expecting to find a thick folder with US 11, 304,508B2 on the tab, complete with a signed assignment from one Aspen Reed, and they would have found an empty folder, or worse, a folder with a memo from 10 years ago saying, "Follow up with A. Reed re-patent assignment." The panic must have been exquisite, a quiet, creeping dread that starts in the stomach of some mid-level corporate counsel and works its way up the food chain, getting more potent with every floor it ascends. By the time that dread reached Griffin's penthouse office, it would be a full-blown 5-alarm fire. Clara had prepared me for this. "They will assume it's a clerical error," she'd said. "They'll tear the archives apart. They'll blame some long-retired paralegal. They will not, under any circumstances, believe they could be this incompetent." And that's exactly what happened. According to Leo's discreet reconnaissance, the entire legal department was in lockdown. They were pulling decades of acquisition paperwork, searching for a ghost document. They were treating it like a missing file, not a foundational crisis of ownership. For 3 days, a tense, electric silence emanated from the executive wing. Then came the first move. It was an email, not from Griffin, of course. Never from Griffin. It was from a vice president of legal affairs, a man named Arthur Vance. The subject line was an innocuous checking in. The tone was breezy, casual. "Hi Aspen," it began. "Hope you're doing well. Quick question for you, as we're doing a little internal housekeeping. We're trying to locate the final assignment paperwork for the flavor agent patent. Do you happen to recall who you worked with on that back in the day? Just trying to track down the file. Thanks." It was a fishing expedition, cloaked in corporate politeness. They were hoping I was as disorganized as they were. They were hoping I'd say, "Oh, I think I signed that with Barbara from legal in 2014, giving them a thread to pull, a story to build. I forwarded the email to Clara with a single word, Phase 1. Her reply was instant. Beautiful. Do not respond. Let them sweat. So I didn't. I let the email sit there, unanswered. In their world of instant replies and constant connectivity, my silence was a statement. It was a void, and they would rush to fill it with their own paranoia. 2 days later, a second email. The tone was slightly more firm. Hi Aspen, just following up on my previous message. It's becoming somewhat time-sensitive for our Q3 filings. If you could just point us in the right direction, it would be a huge help. Best, Arthur. I forwarded it to Clara. Her reply. He used the word time-sensitive. The hook is set. Still, we wait. I pictured Arthur Vance in his office, staring at his screen, waiting for my reply. I pictured him having to walk down the hall to Griffin's office to say, "She's not responding." I pictured Griffin's polished veneer cracking just a little bit, the first hairline fracture in his massive ego. The final, desperate email came on a Friday afternoon. It was from Griffin himself. The mask of politeness was gone. The subject, U. Argent, Patent US 11, 304,508 B2. Aspen, it read. I have been made aware of a significant clerical oversight regarding the intellectual property for the binding agent. Arthur Vance from my legal team will be reaching out to you to schedule a meeting to rectify this immediately. Your full and prompt cooperation is expected. There it was, the threat, wrapped in the language of command. Your cooperation is expected. He still thought he was my boss. He still thought he held the power. He had no idea that he was a king issuing decrees from a castle made of sand, and the tide was coming in. I forwarded it to Clara. Phase 2, I wrote. Her reply came with a link to a calendar invitation. Accept the meeting, she wrote. But not with Arthur Vance. I've just sent a note to Miss Vance informing him that all future correspondence regarding this matter should be directed to me, as legal counsel for Keystone Innovations, LLC. I've proposed a preliminary call for next Wednesday. It was a declaration of war, delivered with the quiet, devastating efficiency of a sniper's bullet. By naming Keystone Innovations, I had officially put the truth on the table. I wasn't Aspen Reed, the disgruntled ex-employee. I was Aspen Reed, the CEO of the company that held their entire future in its hands. The name Keystone Innovations would have sent them scrambling to state and federal databases. They would have discovered it was a legitimate 10-year-old corporation in good standing. They would have seen my name as the sole officer. The puzzle pieces would have snapped together in their minds with a sickening, horrifying click. It wasn't a clerical error. It was a coup. Leo's text that evening was pure poetry. Atmosphere has gone from panic to apocalyptic dread. Griffin just threw a laptop against a wall. They know. The preliminary call, as Clara later recounted, was a masterpiece of legal stonewalling. On the line were Griffin, his newly hired bulldog of an external litigator, and Arthur Vance. Clara was calm, polite, and utterly immovable. They blustered. They threatened. They talked about fiduciary duty and theft of corporate assets. Clara simply listened patiently. When they were done, she said, in her warm, disarming voice, "Gentlemen, it seems there's been a misunderstanding. Keystone Innovations is, and always has been, the legal owner of this patent. My client has no interest in litigation. She does, however, recognize the complex situation Omnisnex now finds itself in. As a gesture of goodwill, she is willing to discuss a potential licensing agreement." Griffin, she told me, exploded.
Licensing agreement?
That is our technology. She developed it on our time, in our lab. Clara's reply was devastatingly simple. Then I assume you'll have no trouble providing the documentation to prove that. The executed work-for-hire agreement. The patent assignment, we can wait. Checkmate. They had nothing. The threats were hollow. Their entire position was based on an assumption. And as any scientist knows, an unverified assumption is the most dangerous variable in any experiment. They were trapped. The shareholders' meeting was in 2 weeks. They had already promised the world a dozen new flavors of Crater Crisps, and Sue Wund, and the woman they had fired, the office mom they had deemed an anchor, was the only person in the world who could sell them the water to make their little sea of promises float. The first move wasn't a thunderous explosion. It was the quiet, deliberate placement of a single chess piece on the board, a move so simple and so obvious that my opponent hadn't seen it until it was far too late. They had been playing checkers, moving pieces one square at a time. I was playing a different game entirely, and I had just put their king in check. The 2 weeks leading up to the shareholders' meeting were a masterclass in corporate panic. Through Leo's updates and Clara's briefings, I had a front-row seat to the slow, agonizing collapse of Griffin's authority. The apocalyptic dread Leo had described was now curdling into desperation. The power in any negotiation lies with the party that can afford to walk away from the table. I could afford to walk away. I had my severance, my savings, and a life of quiet contentment ahead of me if I so chose. Omnisnacks, on the other hand, could not. They were chained to a speeding train of their own making, a train fueled by projected earnings, contractual obligations, and Griffin's colossal ego. The first external sign of trouble came not from Omnisnacks, but from their largest distribution partner, a national grocery conglomerate called Sterling Foods. The CEO of Sterling, a sharp, no-nonsense man named Marcus Thorne, was a veteran of the industry. He had personally known Mr. Abernathy. In the early days of Crater Crisps, I had worked closely with Marcus's team to develop co-branded store displays and promotions. We had a history, a relationship built on trust and performance, not buzzwords. Marcus called my personal cell phone on a Monday morning. I was expecting the call. Clara had predicted it. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. Aspen, Marcus here. What in the goddamn hell is going on at Omnisnacks? His voice was a low growl of pure frustration. I just got off a call with Griffin. He was trying to explain a potential supply chain disruptions for the Crater Crisp line. He was speaking in circles, Aspen, talking about realigning IP assets. It sounded like he was reading from a hostage note. I'm looking at a 10-year strategic partnership agreement that hinges my entire snack aisle profitability on your product. You need to tell me what's happening, and you need to tell me now. This was the moment, the pivot point. I took a deep breath. My voice, when I spoke, was calm and measured. The voice of a CEO, not an ex-employee. Marcus, I said, there is a complex ownership issue with the core technology. It's a situation that Omnisnacks created, and one they are now trying to resolve. There was a pause. I could hear the gears turning in his shrewd, experienced mind. He wasn't asking about the corporate drama. He was asking about risk. His risk, this ownership issue, he said, his tone shifting from angry to intensely focused. Does it involve you? Yes, it does, I replied. My new company is the legal owner of the patent. Another pause, longer this time, then a low chuckle. Oh, he did it, didn't he? That arrogant son of a bitch. He fired you. I knew it. I knew something was wrong when I heard they were bringing in marketing kids to run R&D. Marcus Thorne was old school. He believed in builders, not talkers. He saw exactly what had happened without me needing to explain the betrayal. My next words were carefully chosen, planted like seeds. Marcus, whatever happens between my company and Omnisnacks, I want to give you my personal assurance. The integrity of the flavor binding agent and its production will be maintained. Keystone Innovations is committed to ensuring the stability of the Crater Crisp supply chain. I didn't say how. I didn't make promises I couldn't keep. I just offered him the one thing Griffin couldn't: certainty. I was the source. I was the architect. The supply chain didn't start at a factory. It started with my brain. He understood immediately. The unspoken message was clear. My loyalty was to the product, not the company. If he needed a stable supply of the core technology, he would get it, one way or another. Whether it was through a license to Omnisnacks, or, down the line, a different manufacturer. Thank you, Aspen, he said, and his voice was heavy with meaning. That's all I needed to hear. He hung up. That single phone call was more devastating to Griffin than any legal threat. Marcus Thorne held the power to delist Crater Crisps from thousands of stores nationwide. His confidence in Omnisnacks was shattered. He now knew the real power lay not with the slick CEO, but with the quiet scientist he'd just called. The power was shifting, not with a bang, but with a series of quiet, confidential phone calls. While Griffin was trying to manage a crisis of his own making, I was solidifying my position as the true center of the Crater Crisp universe. The inevitable counteroffer from Omnisnacks came 2 days later. It was a desperate, clumsy attempt to put the genie back in the bottle. Clara got a call from their external litigator. They were prepared to offer me my job back. Not just my old job, but a new title, Vice President of Innovation. They would triple my previous salary. They would give me a massive re-signing bonus. And of course I would be required to sign a new ironclad employment agreement that included the immediate and irrevocable assignment of patent US 11, 304,508B, 2 to Omnisnacks for the sum of $1. Clara listened to the entire offer without interruption. When the lawyer was finished, she simply said, "Thank you for the offer. We will take it under advisement and respond in due course." She called me immediately after. "It's even more pathetic than I expected," she said with a dry laugh. "I think they can buy you. I think you're a disgruntled employee who just wants a bigger title and more money. I still don't understand that you don't want a seat at their table. You want to own the table." We let them wait for 48 agonizing hours. For Griffin, that must have been an eternity. His shareholders' meeting was just over a week away. He was bleeding leverage with every passing hour. Finally, on a Friday afternoon, Clara sent our official response. It was not a counteroffer. It was a single, elegant document, a term sheet for a non-exclusive licensing agreement. It was the same one I had drafted weeks before. The per-unit royalty that would make their eyes water. The quality control clause that gave me final say on all new products. The non-exclusive license. The key person provision. It was a document of total surrender. Clara told me the response from their lawyer was apoplectic. It was unprofessional. It was extortion. It was litigation-worthy. Griffin would never agree to it. Clara's reply was a single sentence. "For the dollar trecentabe." It was make things same. The terms are the terms. We look forward to your prompt response. The panic at Omnisnacks was now reaching a fever pitch. Leo texted me. "They're trying to reverse engineer it. They've got the whole team locked in the lab, trying to replicate the agent from scratch. It's a disaster. They don't have your notes. They don't have your intuition. They're just mixing chemicals and hoping for a miracle." I felt a pang of sympathy for the scientists, my former colleagues, trapped in that lab, being forced to perform scientific malpractice by a desperate, ignorant management team. But this was a necessary part of the process. Omnisnacks had to prove to themselves that they couldn't live without me. They had to fail, publicly and spectacularly. The final piece of the power shift clicked into place the day before the shareholders' meeting. Marcus Thorne, having heard nothing but silence and corporate doublespeak from Griffin, made his move. He sent an official letter to the Omnisnacks board of directors, which was immediately leaked to the financial press. The letter stated that Sterling Foods was putting its 10-year strategic partnership under immediate review pending substantive clarification on the long-term stability of the Crater Crisp supply chain. The leak was a kill shot. Omnisnacks stock, which had been trading at an all-time high on the promise of Project Velocity, began to tank in after-hours trading. The board, which had been content to let Griffin handle the clerical error, was now in a full-blown panic. They were no longer worried about a disgruntled employee. They were worried about shareholder lawsuits. They were worried about their own jobs. The power had not just shifted, it had been completely remade. I was no longer a variable in their equation. I was the equation. Griffin was about to walk into a shareholders' meeting, having promised a golden future, only to find that I owned the gold, the mine, and the road leading to it. His desperate counter-offer wasn't a sign of strength. It was the last gasp of a dying regime. He thought he could solve the problem with money and a title, because money and titles were the only things he understood. He failed to grasp a fundamental truth. You cannot buy back something that was never for sale in the first place. My loyalty had been to the work. My pride was in the creation. He had insulted both, and now, he was about to pay the price. Not in dollars, but in the one currency he truly valued: control. The day of the shareholders' meeting arrived, cloaked in a gray, drizzling rain that perfectly matched the mood at Omnisnack's headquarters. I, however, was in Clara's corner office on the 45th floor, looking down at the city through a sheet of clean glass. The air was crisp, the coffee was excellent, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt a sense of profound, unshakable calm. The call came at 9 a.m. sharp. It was Griffin. His voice was not the booming, confident baritone he used in town halls. It was thin, strained, and stripped of all its artificial bravado. He wanted a meeting. Now, in person. He said he was prepared to be flexible. Clara simply replied, "We can be at your office in 30 minutes. We didn't rush. We took our time. Clara insisted we stop and get fresh croissants from a bakery near her office. Never walk into a surrender looking hungry, she advised with a wink. When we finally walked into the opulent, soulless lobby of Omnisnacks, it felt like entering a foreign country. The security guard, who had seen me every day for 15 years, barely made eye contact. The air was thick with a tense, funereal silence. We were escorted directly to the main boardroom. It was a space I had only ever been in to set up presentations for other people. The long, polished mahogany table reflected the grim faces of the men sitting around it. Griffin was at the head of the table, flanked by his lawyer, and a collection of grim-faced board members I recognized from company reports. They all looked exhausted. They looked like men who had been staring into the abyss all night, and the abyss had stared back. Griffin did not stand up. He gestured to the two empty chairs opposite him. "Aspen, Clara," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Thank you for coming." The pleasantries were over. The desperation was palpable. He slid a piece of paper across the table. It was our term sheet. Covered in red ink, he had crossed out the per-unit royalty and written in a lump sum figure. It was a large number, 7 figures, a life-changing amount of money for most people. But it was an insult. It was a fraction of what the technology was worth, and it was a transparent attempt to buy the patent outright, to cut me out of the future of my own creation. He had crossed out the quality control clause. He had crossed out the non-exclusive license. He was still trying to win. He was still trying to claw back control. I didn't even look at the number. I just pushed the paper back across the table. "No," I said. My voice was quiet, but it filled the cavernous room. It was the calmest I had ever felt. The power in that room had been inverted so completely it was almost a physical force. Griffin stared at me, his face a mask of disbelief. "No? Aspen, this is an incredibly generous offer. It's more than you would have made in a lifetime of working here." That was his mistake. He still thought this was about a paycheck. He still saw me as the humble employee he had fired. "It was never about the money, Griffin," I said, my voice as cold and clear as ice. "It was about respect, respect for the work, something you clearly don't understand." A muscle twitched in his jaw. The lawyer next to him cleared his throat, about to launch into some legal threat. But one of the board members, an older man with weary eyes named Peterson, held up a hand. "Let her speak," he said, his gaze fixed on me, and so I did. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lecture them. I spoke to them as a scientist, as a creator. I told them the story of the crater crisp, of Mr. Abernathy's vision, of the late nights in the lab. I explained the chemistry of the binding agent, the delicate balance of molecules they had treated like a commodity. I explained that their new dessert flavors were a chemical impossibility under the current formulation, a fact I had told their team months ago. "You didn't want innovation," I said, looking directly at Griffin. "You wanted a marketing slogan. You took a masterpiece of food science and you tried to treat it like a cheap paint-by-numbers kit. You failed to understand what you had, and then you threw away the only person who did." The room was silent. The board members were no longer looking at Griffin with deference. They were looking at him with a dawning, horrified comprehension. They were realizing that the man they had entrusted with their flagship brand was not just arrogant, he was incompetent. "The terms are the terms," Clara said. her voice cutting through the silence. The royalty, the quality control, the non-exclusive license, everything. That is the only path forward. Griffin finally broke. He slammed his fist on the table. A sudden, petulant burst of noise in the quiet room. This is extortion. You can't do this. I already did, I said softly. The moment you called me into that sterile little room and had a stranger read from a script, you did this. You decided my 15 years of loyalty were worthless. You decided the architect of your success was disposable. You just made a catastrophic miscalculation about who owned the blueprints. I stood up. Clara stood with me. You have a shareholders meeting in less than 2 hours, I said, my voice leaving no room for negotiation. You can walk into that room and announce that Project Velocity is dead and your supply chain is broken. Or you can walk in there with a signed licensing agreement. The choice is yours. We'll be in the lobby. We walked out of the boardroom, leaving a tableau of shattered egos and impending doom in our wake. We didn't go to the lobby. We went to the cafeteria. I bought a bottle of water. It felt surreal, standing in the place where I had eaten lunch for 15 years, now holding the entire company's fate in my hands. It took them 45 minutes. A pale, sweating Arthur Vance found us sitting at one of the small plastic tables. He was holding a single, freshly printed document in a pen. He didn't say a word. He just laid the clean, unaltered licensing agreement on the table. My agreement. My terms. I read it over once, then again. Every clause was exactly as Clara had drafted it. I picked up the pen. My hand was perfectly steady as I signed my name, Aspen Reed, next to the title, CEO, Keystone Innovations, LLC. Arthur Vance scurried away with the signed document as if it were a holy relic. The vindication was not a fiery explosion of triumph. It was a quiet, deep, and satisfying hum. It was the feeling of a complex equation finally being solved, of a chemical reaction reaching a perfect, stable state. It wasn't about revenge. It was about balance. It was about a system, thrown into chaos by arrogance and incompetence, finally being restored to order. The news of Griffin's fate came a week later, not through a press release, but through a quiet email from Marcus Thorne. Heard the board finally came to their senses. Good for you, Aspen. Let me know when you're ready to talk about what's next. Griffin was out. Fired. The board had used his failure at the shareholders' meeting, where he'd been forced to announce a strategic partnership with a company owned by an employee he'd just terminated, as justification to remove him. He wasn't a disruptor. He was just a disaster. They had shown him the same door they had shown me, only his didn't come with a multi-million-dollar licensing agreement on the other side. My new reality was taking shape. I wasn't just the office mom anymore. I was the office landlord, and the rent was due. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of construction, not of anger or retribution, but of creation. I was no longer repairing a broken system. I was building a new one from the ground up. My first move was to lease a small state-of-the-art laboratory space in a new tech park on the other side of town. It was clean, bright, and full of possibility. It smelled of new paint and untapped potential, a stark contrast to the stale, tired air of my old lab. My first hire was Leo. He submitted his resignation to Omnisnacks the day after my licensing agreement was signed. He walked into my empty lab with a box of his personal effects and a grin that stretched from ear to ear. "He's professor," he said, setting the box down. "I'm ready for my first class." We became a two-person powerhouse. We were lean, fast, and unburdened by corporate bureaucracy. Our work was pure science. We began experimenting, pushing the boundaries of the flavor-binding agent in ways I had only dreamed of. We weren't trying to create tiramisu-flavored corn chips. We were exploring its potential for nutraceuticals, for medical foods, for applications that could genuinely help people. The royalty checks from Omnisnacks began to arrive. They were staggering. The numbers were so large they felt like typos. That money wasn't just profit, it was fuel. It was the capital we needed to build our new world, a world where innovation wasn't a buzzword, but a daily practice. The quality control clause in my agreement became my quiet instrument of change at Omnisnacks. Their new, chastened CEO, the former COO, who understood operations, not just optics, knew he had no choice but to comply. Every new flavor concept, every line extension, had to come across my desk, or more accurately, my lab bench for approval. The first proposal they sent was for a flamin' hot pickle flavor. It was another one of Kyle's brainchildren. I rejected it, not out of spite, but out of science. My rejection wasn't a simple no, it was a 2-page scientific brief, explaining exactly why the combination of high-concentration capsaicin and acetic acid would lead to long-term flavor degradation on the shelf. I proposed an alternative, a smoky chipotle lime flavor, that would be more stable and have a broader flavor profile. They were stunned. They were used to vague marketing feedback. They weren't used to being given a scientifically sound solution. They made my version. It became their most successful new flavor in 5 years. I was, in essence, their outsourced, untouchable head of R&D. I was doing the same work I had always done, but now, on my own terms, from my own lab, and for a price that reflected my true value. It wasn't about revenge. It was about demonstrating the cost of my absence. It was about creating an environment where competence was the only currency that mattered. I framed a copy of Griffin's final, desperate email, the one where he demanded my cooperation. I hung it on the wall of my new office, right next to the patent. It wasn't a trophy of my victory over him. It was a reminder that true power isn't in a title or a corner office. It's in the quiet, undeniable force of being essential. It's a reminder that when you build something of value, you must never ever let someone else convince you that you are not its rightful owner. This entire journey, this painful, terrifying, and ultimately liberating experience, taught me a lesson that I want to share with you, especially with those of you who have ever been made to feel small, overlooked, or disposable in a place where you have poured your heart and soul. Your value is not determined by a performance review or a job title. It is not determined by the people who sign your paychecks. Your true value is inherent. It is the sum of your knowledge, your passion, your integrity, and your unique ability to see the world in a way no one else can. They can take your job. They can take your desk. They can take your parking spot. But they cannot take your worth unless you give it to them. For 15 years, I let OmniSnacks define my value. I accepted the title of office mom, believing that my loyalty and my quiet competence would eventually be rewarded. I was wrong. The system isn't designed to reward quiet competence. It's designed to reward the loudest voice in the room. So my advice to you is this: learn to own your value, document your successes, understand the tangible impact of your work. If you create something, protect it. Build your own legal and financial fortresses, even if they're small. Your own LLC, your own professional network, your own just-in-cases fund. These are not signs of disloyalty. They are acts of profound self-respect. They are the tools that give you the freedom to walk away from a table where you are not being served. My story isn't about getting even. It's about getting free. It's about transforming a moment of profound betrayal into a foundation for a future I now control completely. It's a future where I am the architect, the builder, and the owner. And it's a future that is more satisfying than any revenge could ever be. So if this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt like the quiet, essential engine in a machine that didn't appreciate you, please like this video and share it. Leave a comment below and tell me about a time you realized your own value. Every story shared is a brick in a wall of collective strength. And don't forget to subscribe, because we are all architects of our own lives, and it's time we started drawing our own blueprints.